Good afternoon. Today we'll be talking about the two units. The first we'll be talking about the tribal communities in India. From here, almost every year we will finding about the certain questions coming out. And any one of us who is talking about the second paper particularly. And once you have read first paper and second paper together, apart from the rural agrarian structure, the tribal communities in India, that become the one, another dimension, another topic that has to be read separately. Particularly when we are looking at the Indian context and when we are looking at the Indian society. Then when we are looking at the current data of the government, the tribals constitute approximately 8.6% of the total Indian population. And their population is estimated to be approximately 10.4 crore. And particularly in reference to Article 342, 730 scheduled tribes have been notified. But when we are looking at the sociology, you look at the syllabus, what you find that the first subunit which begins in a tribal one is basically the definitional problem or problem of definition of tribes in India. And when we are looking at the Indian population, the tribals are the most important segment of the Indian society. They are basically the octothons, the real inhabitants of the country. Though like the Indian society, we do find the diversity prevalent among the tribes in Indian context. The diversity that could be viewed in terms of linguistic affinity, geographical spread, racial or ethnic character. Diversity could also be viewed in terms of the labor economy. And at the same time, yet another dimensions to look at the diversity among the tribals in India has been the level of cultural contact. It means this, when we are approaching the tribal communities in India, this very diversity prevalent of the certain parameters which you just said, it at least makes us realize the tribal community does not constitute an informal category. The diversity seems to be an important dimension in our understanding of the tribals. Though somehow or other, when we say that the 730 scheduled tribes have been notified under Article 342 of the Indian Constitution, well, almost in the different states of the country, in the different geographical regions, the spread of tribals could be found. And for your sociological preparation in terms of tribes, I don't know how far you would be able to remember the names of the tribes, few names. But as far as the geographical distribution of the tribes goes, as the syllabus talks about, geographical spread of tribes in India, you basically need to focus on BS Guha's classification. BS Guha, in his geographical spread of tribes in India, talked about the three zones, that is north and northeast zone, that is consisting of the sub-Himalayan region and mountainous valley of eastern frontiers of India, within which the tribal groups of Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, Manipur in the eastern part, whereas the northern parts, tribes of eastern Kashmir, eastern Punjab, Himachal Pradesh, northern UP are included. Some of the important tribes living below Assam and Tibet are Aka, Dafla, Miri, Gurung, Apatini, on the west of the Shuhasni river. Whereas the Mismi tribe lives in the higher range of Dabang and Lohit river. And at the further east are found Khamtis, and beyond are various Naga tribes. In the sub-Himalayan region of Sikkim and northern portion of Darjeeling, there are Lepchas, and in the Himalayan region of eastern UP are Tharus, Boksha, Khasa, Jonsaris. The second geographical region is a central or middle zone consisting of plateaus or mountains built between Indo-Gangetic plains to the north and roughly Krishna river to the south, separated from the northeast zone. In this zone, the tribal groups of Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, UP, Rajasthan, northern Maharashtra, Bihar, Odisha are included. And when you look at the important tribes living in this zone, they are basically Savara, Godhara, Borido, Kharia, Bhumis. In the plateau of Chota Nagpur live the Santhals, the Ho, Birhor, and further along in the Vindhya range like Katkari, Bhil, and in both sides of Satpura are Agariyas, Baigas, and in the hills of Bastar are Muria, Maria, and Abuz Maria Gonds. So this is the second zone of BS Guha, and third zone is basically southern zone, which is falling south of Krishna river, stretching from Wayanad to Cape Comorin. And the states includes are Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu and Kerala. Beginning from northeast of this zone, the Chenchus occupies Nalamala hills along with the western Ghats. From the Lorga of South Canada, Todas live, and in the Wayanad area live Irula, Panians, Kurumba, etc. Remember few names if such kind of question comes out. However, when looking at the B.S. Guha's classification of the geographical spread of tribes in India, it has basically been said that the Guha, while talking about the three zones, somehow or other has left the Andaman island or island region. So, in a broader kind of perspective classification, geographical spread of the tribes in India, apart from the three what B.S. Guha has provided, yet another zone that will come out is basically the Andaman and Nicobar Island, which many consider to be the fourth zone, in which the important tribes like Jarawa, Onge, Sentinelese, Andamanis and Nicobaris live. So this is the one which is most factual, and in this very perspective you will have to basically talk about the geographical spread. But one of the most important debate, one of the most important dimension or the perspective that you need to understand while developing the ideas of the tribes in India, that though it is true that when we started or when the sociology began as a discipline studying the urban industrial society, then it has not represented the tribal society. And somehow or other the social anthropology, another branch of social science that developed, that romanticized with the simpler society, with the tribal society, and that acquisition still goes. That anthropology romanticizes with the tribal society. But very soon, as the cross-cultural studies started emerging out, we realize in sociology that the study of tribal society is necessary to understand the totality of a human universe. And if you really want to understand the totality of the human universe, somehow or other, we now need to focus on the tribal society. They will also be providing you the perspective of social development. They will also be providing the perspective that how societies have evolved, societies have developed. And they have often been referred as aborigines, real inhabitants. And the different scholars have used the different kind of names to the tribals. For example, G.H. Hutton calls them aborigines, G.S. Ghurye calls them backward Hindus, L.P. Vidyarthi refers them as a culture universe, P.C. Joshi calls them the submerged humanity. It means when we have realized that if we need to understand the totality of human universe, or when we need to understand the society comprehensively, the studies of the tribal society seems to be an important prerequisite. And despite considering tribals to be one of the real inhabitants of the country, the real autochthons of the country, when we come to the definitional aspect that who the tribes are, how to define tribe, we find about a certain kind of ambiguity pertaining to the definition of tribe. What are the criteria to be picked up to define tribe, to approach tribe? These are some prominent issues which would be there in the sociological discourse that we need to address. And it is not only when talking about the Indian context. Who are the tribes? What are the criterions? This debate has intensified not only the national concerns but also at the international arena. And the problem of definition also seems to be coming to the front because of the fact that in the early tradition, neither the sociologists nor the anthropologists have adequately tried to provide or address such kind of issues. Today, anthropology, social anthropology, sociology, administrators, the social workers, the missionaries, the social reformers, though now seems to be somewhere fascinated with the tribal society and they are claiming to represent the tribal society at both theoretical and a practical level. But it is also true that despite this claim, ambiguity persists. And let me quote one of the statements of Yogesh Atal. Yogesh Atal says that despite social anthropology's primary concern with the tribals, they have not been able to develop an universally applicable definition of tribe. Even Arthur Wilke, W-I-L-K-E, he remarks that while portraying the tribes in India, ambiguity prevails in India's official portrait of the tribal people. And thus, the debate intensifies pertaining to who the tribes are. What are the criterions on the basis of which tribes could be understood, tribes could be defined? But before I go on talking about the debate on the certain lines in terms of the problem of definition of tribes in India, I said that when we are talking about the Indian population as a whole, they are considered to be the real inhabitants of the country. And time and again, attempts have been initiated not only to approach the tribes but also to administer them, develop them. But despite this, the ambiguity seems to be important, seems to be persisting in the Indian context. And at the same time, at another perspective, at another dimension of problem will be emerging out. That would be in terms of the caste-tribe interaction. Do we need to view caste and tribe as a poles apart? As the many works have done so. However, we need to remember that when we are comparing the tribal scenario of the Indian society with that of the world, either we are talking about South Africa, or we are talking about New Zealand, or we are talking about Australia, or we talk about America. The way in these countries, in these nations, we have found a sharp distinction between the real inhabitants, the indigenous people, and the white colonizers. That cannot be established in the Indian context. Since time immemorial, caste and tribes have interacted with one another. And thus, you can also imagine a question in terms of tribe caste continuum within which the certain questions could come out, the work on the wombs, and that way the things will be coming out. I'll pick up that one separately. When we're looking at the problem of definition of tribes, you please prepare two dimensions. The first dimension is sociological, anthropological dimensions. That how the sociology and anthropology has approached tribe. And the second dimension is basically the constitutional or politico-administrative dimension. So that way, the tribes and the problem of definition of tribes that could be talked about. And one of the best accepted definition of the tribes is from the Imperial Gazetteer of India, which defines tribe as a collection of family or families, number of families bearing a common name, speaking a common dialect, occupying or professing to occupy a common territory, and it is usually not endogamous, though usually they might have been so. This is the one definition sometimes which you might have gone through in terms of Imperial Gazetteer of India. When you look at the D.N. Majumdar's perspective, he approaches tribes as a social group with a territorial affiliation, endogamy, absence of specialization, ruled by the tribal officers, united in language or dialect, and also recognizing social distance with other castes or tribes. And the tribes are conscious of their homogeneity in terms of ethnic and territorial integration. Whereas when you look at S.C. Dubey, then S.C. Dubey lists 6 characteristics, and which he considered that this use of these 6 characteristics would be useful in developing the concept of tribe. Number 1, the community's habitation to the particular territory dates back to the period where they are the early dwellers. Number 2, they usually dwell in isolated hills and forests. Number 2. Number 3, their sense of history is shallow, in the sense that that the remember history gets merged with the mythology. Number 4, the level of techno-economic development among them is low. Number 5, on the basis of cultural ethos, languages or dialect, institutions, beliefs, customs, and their worldview, they are different from other societies. And number 6, they are usually non-hierarchical and undifferentiated. It means we are talking about the habitation to particular territory, dwelling in isolated hill and forest, sense of history is shallow, techno-economic development is low, on the basis of cultural ethos, they are different from others, and they are usually non-hierarchical and undifferentiated. However, before I go further, there may be a possibility of asking a question in terms of a stratification or class among tribes. When you are saying that they are undifferentiated, they are non-hierarchical. But of late, when you start looking at the different works, we find about that how, either in terms of ethnicity or in terms of the new kind of developmental perspectives, the developmental journey that has been introduced to the tribal scenario, we have found about that how, on the basis of the economic dimension, a class perspective is also emerging among the tribes. That is reflecting certain sort of inequality prevalent among the tribes, or is emerging among the tribes. You pick up the landed aristocracy in terms of Bhil, Gonds and others, which produce a class of gentry which is continuing. And then on the economic basis, you talk about the class perspective, either in terms of the services, administrative services, or the developmental perspectives. So that way, if there is any question on the class dimensions of the tribe, you can pick up from there. Imperial Gazetteer, D.N. Majumdar, S.C. Dubey, through which the socio-anthropological perspective that came out, that we basically tried to approach tribals on the basis of geographical territory, the distinct identity, a distinct dialect, cultural homogeneity, and also on the unifying social organization. It means these are the certain dimensions through which we try to approach tribals sociologically and social anthropologically. But the second dimension that has been there in terms of the constitutional one, that seems to be the most important in Indian context. Constitutionally, there is a reference of Article 366(25), you can check it out, along with the Article 342. That becomes the most significant one. It means that constitutionally, while perceiving tribes, Article 366, Clause 25 and Article 342 are the most instrumental one. Post-independently, the constitution makers basically wanted to integrate the tribals with the mainstream society. And when they wanted them to integrate with the mainstream society, they also wanted this integration without having an interference in their customs and traditions. And thus, constitutionally, the tribes were classified under Article 366, 25 and 342, along with the 5th and the 6th schedule. And thus, the concept of tribe, mind my line there, thus, concept of tribe in India, which you refer as a scheduled tribe. So they are referred as a scheduled tribe because they have been classified under Article 366, 25, 342, along with the 5th and 6th schedule. So they are referred to as a scheduled tribe. But the concept of tribes in India is basically politico-administrative in nature. And whether you like it or not, how to view tribes in India is basically politico-administrative concepts. That how they will be notified through Article 342. So that way I am saying that who is a tribe is basically politico-administrative concept in the Indian scenario. And thus when we are looking at the certain kind of sociological works, we find about that how it has always been accused that there is a certain kind of ambiguity even prevalent in the government officials and the government understanding of the tribes. And the way somewhere in the early period, the economic backwardness, isolation, racial characteristics, nomadic or semi-nomadic life, through which the tribes were approached in a political administrative dimension. Today's reality seems to be altogether different. And in this very perspective, I basically want you to remember one name that is called Pethi Jagannath. And I quote Pethi Jagannath, who argues that most of the criteria are arbitrarily chosen, though broadly strong kinship ties, common territory, common language, dialect, importance of land, water and forest are the certain features through which the tribes are there. But the way in a government official documentation, the certain criterions have been picked up, it seems that they are arbitrarily chosen. And there has been a very strong observation by Ayyappan that if anyone asks us the definition of a tribe, then we should simply say that we do not have as such. It is too difficult to define what species are. or what a species is. Similarly, asking any anthropologist or sociologist to define what tribe is, that is too difficult kind of perspective. And that's why in terms of the Pethi Jagannath, we said that most of the criterions earlier what was picked up to approach tribe by the government, politico-administratively, that seems to be arbitrarily chosen. The reality seems to be different from there. So this is the problem of definition of tribes, which will be picking from the socio-anthropological one, will be picking up from the constitutional perspective, the politico-administrative concept. And similarly, this question has also been asked in your GS, that why tribes are called scheduled tribe in India. Such kind of questions could be done since you are in a sociology. So you better understand that very perspective. Yet another area of interest in a tribal studies has been the interaction between tribe and caste, which I was just talking about, where we talked about the concept of tribe-caste continuum. Though tribes have been considered as the indigenous population of the country, where caste has been considered as a segmentalized hierarchical division precisely of the Hindu society. In this sense, tribe and caste have been viewed as a two ideal types, two polar categories in terms of analyzing the continuum. Though in terms of when we are focusing on the interaction and exchange, acculturation and assimilation has taken place. And in this context, remember the name better, in this context, Surjit Sinha popularizes the concept tribe-caste continuum. The various empirical works done by the sociologists, social anthropologists, they reveal that there has always been a mutual give and take, reciprocal relationship between the tribe and a caste. And there has also been a reality that how the tribals have frequently adopted the certain characteristics of the caste society, in which N.K. Bose talks about the Hindu method of observation. Gure calls them the backward Hindus. And when we focus it from the perspective of observation of Louis Dumont, then Louis Dumont says that the tribals adopted the characteristics of caste as the advantage associated with the superior form of economic production and division of labor. Since they consider that there is a superior form of economic production and division of labor, the tribals adopted the caste or characteristics of caste which proved beneficial to them. It means adoption of the behavioral pattern, the certain characteristics by the tribes of caste is a reality. Though we have very little example, very less example compared to tribe adopting the caste characteristics, and a caste adopting the tribal characteristics is very low. However, when we look at the Badagas of Nilgiri Hills, we find about it how the caste adopting the tribal characteristics, such kind of examples in the Badagas of Nilgiri Hills can be provided. The socio-cultural continuity between tribe and caste in India is so great that sometimes it becomes too difficult to separate or distinguish one from the another. And thus once again I am saying, and in this sense you can also quote that when we are talking about the tribal scenario, either in terms of South Africa, we are talking in New Zealand or Australia, Australian Aborigines, or we are talking about the Native Americans, the way the sharp distinction between the indigenous population and white colonizers is evident, that cannot be reflected in the Indian context. And hence, though the tribe and caste seems to be the two different ideal types, a continuous interaction has taken place between these two, within which your focus should be more on the tribe-caste continuum, which is work on the womb is popularized by Surjit Sinha. Once you have done that one, either when you have addressed the definitional problems from the sociological, anthropological perspective and the constitutional, political, administrative perspective, once you have talked about the tribe caste interaction, and when we have talked about the geographical classification, geographical spread of tribals in India from the B.S. Guha's classification, then now you would be basically looking at either in terms of autonomy, integration, which are the part of our syllabus. But I always say that this has been part of the syllabus earlier as well. When we are talking about the policies of tribal administration and development, we find about these dimensions in terms of the tribal perspective. And in this way, you basically need to talk about the three dimensions. The policies of isolation or segregation, policies of assimilation, and policies of integration. This will make you understand integration, autonomy, and other kind of perspective. But do not prepare on that way. Talk about in terms of the policy, tribal policies of administration, colonial and post-colonial. And right from the colonial period till date, how to administer, what kind of developmental strategies should be adopted for the tribal society? It has been a matter of concern, not only for the sociologists, social anthropologists, social reformers, the social welfareists, but also for the administrators and the government. In February 2004, the government of India issued a national policy of tribals. Now you can understand the certain kind of tentativeness we are talking about. In February 2004, the government of India issued a national policy of tribals. And for the first time, government of India formulated a national policy on scheduled tribe. Before that, none had existed. Particularly in the colonial times, what existed was the approaches aimed to provide solutions to the tribal problems. And these approaches could be viewed from the policies of isolation or segregation, the policy of assimilation, and policy of integration. And sometimes it is also true that the way we find the term, the use of the term tribe, this basically seems to be colonial construct. And many empirical examples have shown this, that whatever the name we have given calling them the tribals, they do not call themselves by this name. So historically, the tribals who have been considered to be the indigenous population, the real inhabitants of the country, though the popular term tribe, what we use today, was not in a practice. Rather, they were known by their original names. However, there seems to be a certain lack of systematic analysis. But in a classical mythologies, either we are talking about the Ramayana, Mahabharata. In a classical mythologies, we have found examples of Irula, Paniyans, Kurumba in South India, Ahom, Bodo in Northeast, and also we have the mentioning of Gonds, Bhils in Central India. But overall, the tribal interaction with the outside world was almost limited, and the tribes lived in their own geographical territory, professing their self-reliant economy, speaking their own dialect, and reflecting the similar cultural homogeneity. During the epic eras, in the kingdom periods, some sporadic examples are there where the outside world has come in contact with the tribals. But a more or less laissez-faire approach, non-interventionist approach persisted. But with the advent of the Britishers, advent of the colonial administrators, the interventionist approach to the tribal began. The colonizers tried to bring them under the administrative fold, which many times met with a protest. And to deal with this, the colonizer basically adopted, mind the word, double-aged policy, EDGED, double-aged policy. That is, bestowing the responsibility of administration to the local jamindars and kings, and thus succeeding in collection of revenues, but also diverting the discontent and protest against the local kings and jamindars. This is called double-aged policy, what the Britishers adopted. Britishers also realized that it will be too difficult to bring the tribals in a one uniform administrative fold. Thus, they adopted interventionist approach in some areas, non-interventionist approach in some areas, and this way, Scheduled District Act 1874 is the most important one, which somehow or other continued in 1935 Government of India Act. In this very perspective, yesterday in our class I was talking about that how Gure and Elvin's debate that has to be raised. Now I am bringing it here. In 1939, Wheeler Elvin proposed national park theory. And when you say national park theory, he is basically emphasizing on non-interventionist approach, as he considered tribals to be the noble savages and urged to keep them like that. In one of his publication, in one of his work that is called Loss of Nerve, Wheeler Elvin writes that around the globe, not we are talking about India, around the globe, you have found this example, that whenever the non-tribals have entered to the tribal areas, there has occurred the loss of nerve among the tribals. Their right on land and forest has not been respected. And this way, the loss of nerve has taken place. But this very national park theory proposed by Wheeler Elvin in 1939 was criticized severely. And it was termed as Zooification or museumification of tribals. That when we are talking about the tribal life, we are somewhere or other favoring Zooification, museumification of a tribal life. And one of the associates of Gandhiji, A.B. Thakkar, popularly called as a Bappa Thakkar, he basically said that it seems that anthropologists want to preserve tribals as a Jewish specimen for the interests of their own discipline. And that way, the concept Zooification or museumification of tribal life that comes out. Even G.S. Gure, who referred tribals as a backward Hindus, became critical of Elvin's proposition, the non-interventionist approach. Though we also need to remember that when we are talking about the national park theory, it was not, Elvin does not or did not propose that one because he considered tribals were or tribals will become endangered, or they could survive only through museumification. Rather, it was basically to save the tribals. The very underlying principle on which this national park theory of Elvin was based, it was basically to save the tribals or these simple people, their vulnerability from the exploitation of the nefarious design and the strategies of outsiders, merchants, money lenders, liquor vendors, and most importantly, the grabbers of land. The land grabbers are there. There are so many. So basically, at the core of this national park theory was basically to save this simple tribal life, tribal society, communities from the nefarious activities or strategies of outsiders, the land grabbers, the merchants, the liquor vendors. And that way the loss of nerve that has been, I just talked about, that could be quoted. Most of the outsiders who will be either entering to the tribal areas, their interest is basically in terms of the natural resources available in the tribal society. And there have been many works where we find about how the non-tribals have basically exploited the tribal women sexually. And in this very perspective, the very justification of national park theory has to be understood by us. And I quote one line of Barry Elvin. He says, opening up the road in tribal areas should be the interest of tribals and not for those who exploit them. Open the road, but ensure that the opening of the roads which is going to the tribal communities, the tribal areas, tribal geographical territory, it should be for the interest of the tribals. It should not be for those whose intention is to exploit the tribals. Now let me give you a few names. When you talk about the Herbert Ridgely, he argued that this approach, that is approach of isolation or segregation, adapted by the Britishers, succeeded in non-entry of caste in a tribal areas. Similarly, S.C. Dubé comments that this was a conscious attempt in part of the colonial administrators to separate tribals from the caste. And in this way, either we are talking about A.V. Thakkar, we are talking about the G.S. Ghurye, they basically favored the assimilationist approach to the tribal society. And that was the second approach. They recognize the tribal problems. It is not so that the assimilationist approach, tribal problems were not recognized. Yes, they were recognized. Certainly they were recognized. But either solution lies in terms of isolation. If the problems of the tribals are to be solved, should there be emphasis on the non-interventionist perspective? Thus, in the assimilationist approach, it was urged that the problem of tribal society needs to be solved through, not through continued isolation, but to bring the tribals in the mainstream society. Isolation or segregation would not be providing any possible solutions to the problems persisting in the tribal society. If the problems which is prevalent, which you consider to be the problem, which they are to be addressed, then the tribals must be linked with the mainstream society. And in this very perspective, the continuous interaction which has taken place right since millennia, right since the historical times, that was basically quoted. Not denying the fact that tribals be linked with the mainstream society, not to be left in isolation. It was a very noble thought. It was noble in character. But I'm sorry to say, when we look at most of the empirical works done on the tribal society, and it's still going on, we find about this assimilationist approach resulted into loss of traditions, destruction of culture, and this cultural contact with the outside world, either in terms of the Hindus or Muslims, Islam, or in terms of Christianity or Buddhism, they adopted such religions. The methods of observations, either in absorption, either in terms of Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism, that has started emerging out, and consequently, the very tribal identity which was distinct, which was separate, that is diluted. The traditions started dissipating, the culture started being replaced, and in this very perspective, conversions took place. And out of this, mind one word, the process that began, brought by the assimilationist approach, is basically called detribalization. Tribal identity is gone because they have converted. Either they have adopted the Hindu method of observation, they have turned to Christianity, or they to Islam, or to the Buddhist kind of practices. So their own distinct identity, their own distinct way of culture, that has provided them certain kind of homogeneity, cultural homogeneity, that was destroyed. And this very de-tribalization process began. The life support system of the tribals was completely destroyed. Their socio-cultural habitat was gone, became corrupt. And some of them, some communities, they became refugee in their own world. And in this very perspective, Walter Fernandez, while analyzing the impact of the aestheticist perspective, called the tribals internal refugees, the refugees within themselves. The destruction of culture and religion also led to the emergence of problem of identity. Such kind of question comes up. The problem of identity among the tribals, reflecting ethnic identity movements. Do you remember ethnic and identity movements we talked about? There we talked about one of the dimensions would be the tribal. Now link it from there. And very soon it was realized that now we needed to have a different kind of perspective, different kind of approach to the tribal administration and development. And thus, the third approach that emerged out is basically called policy of integration. Is still considered to be one of the best policy, which was in between the previous two. There was a focus on the conservation of their culture, but also to ensure their participation in the mainstream society. It means some institutions needs to be preserved, kept away, and some to be brought within the interactive integration. That is integration with equality and dignity. And if assimilation favored homogenization of culture, then integration is subscribed to the Chinese maxim that let the thousand flowers bloom, let the thousand schools of thought flourish, implying that integration is a celebration of the principle of diversity. You integrate it, do not assimilate it. In assimilation, they are losing their identity. They are merging themselves with the broader one. Integration will provide them to live with equality, to live with dignity. Their identity has not to be merged by anyone. The kind of cultural imperialism that is taking place, that could be addressed through the approach of integration. In this context, if I ask you to recall back one of the statement of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, that while addressing a gathering in a Nehru, he says, I don't know whose lifestyle is better, yours or ours. But I am quite sure that in certain ways your lifestyle is better than us. We want you to preserve your culture, but we also want you to ensure your participation in a mainstream nation building. And in this very perspective, the Panchsheel policy came out. And this Panchsheel policy of tribal administration, I talk about the five, Panchsheel 5. We must respect their rights on land and forest, number one. Number two, let them grow in their own genius. We should not judge them or impose everything on them. Rather, our endeavor should be to encourage them. Number three, we should train them in such a way that their own team of men develop who would take the responsibility of administration and development. Number four, we should not over-administer them, nor we should impose multiplicity of programs. And number five, we should judge them by results and not by statistics. That is, judgment should be on the account of money spent, on amount of the money spent, Not on the amount of money spent, but on the character built. And that way, the Panchil policy comes out. But I'm sorry to say that when you're looking at these all five, somewhere in a sociological, anthropological perspective, a very critical analysis has been there. Somewhere the certain shadow of glimpses of the Marxian perspective comes out. That how the way the natural resources available in the tribal society has been exploited. How the tribal society has been used for industrialization or hydel dams and projects. It has not benefited much to the tribals. The major benefit has been restricted to the non-tribals. And thus way, somewhere, perspective of underdevelopment that prevails in a tribal society, that has been there, which many times has led to the certain kind of discontent, which has many times led to the certain kind of unrest. So either in terms of the separate statehood, autonomous, such kind of demands have been coming on. We have been finding about in terms of the Jharkhand and other kind of perspective, we are finding about the issues of domicile that have started emerging out pertaining to the tribal identity, tribal society. These all are the natural outcomes. And that's a very critical perspective that has been there. Yes, integration has been there. But I'm sorry that integration has not been done with equality. The integration has not tried to protect their dignity, consequently leading to the various protest movements, insurgency, and even extremism. And you find about that how this underdevelopment has somewhere led many tribal groups, tribal areas to become the sympathizer of Naxalism. This is very us versus they. That depiction is still there. Even in the Delhi, we find about that how we look and more precisely how we basically talk about the Northeast people. So this is the duality between us versus they. That distinction is still persists. And in this very perspective, if I quote D.N. Majumdar says that only materialistic integration has taken place, not the complete integration, that is integration with equality and dignity. So in terms of the colonial and post-colonial one, and then when you talk about the certain developmental perspective, right from the CDP, so you start talking about L1 committee, Renuka Ray committee, all right, Siliu Au committee, LP Vidyarthis task force. So that way, the certain committees and their recommendations to the tribal development could be found out. And in this way, sometimes they are asking the questions on PVGTG. So how the tribal Ministry of Tribal Affairs has launched a scheme of development of PBTGs covering 75 groups for their comprehensive socio-economic development. In the states through conservation cum development plans who submit their reports on the basis of which center provides 100% grants in it. And PBTs are the most vulnerable segment among the tribal population. And time and again, post-independence, since independence, it has always been argued that the tribal development project, the most assertive developmental initiatives which have been there, many times tribals have been kept outside the major chunk of development. Hence now the time has come to direct the developmental funds, the direct developmental strategy toward the tribals in which the most vulnerable section PBTG that has to be talked about. The Debar Commission, even Debar, has identified the primitive tribal groups as separate category, less developed among the tribal population. Even LP Vidyarthi task force recognized this category. And particularly from the mid-70s, the government of India initiated the program to identify the vulnerable tribal groups as a separate category. Earlier, 52 such groups were identified, and in 1993, 23 more groups were added, making the total of 75 PBTGs. So you look at from that perspective, the things would be there. Keep an eye on the developmental perspectives. There may be certain questions in terms of the economic problems of the tribes. There could be in terms of impact of developmental programs. And at the same time, when you're talking about these all programs and policies, then we're critically analyzing that one. Yet another dimension that will become the most important one among the tribals would be the issues of displacement and rehabilitation. We talked about the ecological concerns and others in terms of hydel projects to the dams to the mining. All right. And that way, when we're talking about the tribal scenario, just I said that most of the outsiders who have been basically fascinated, who drew their attention to the tribal society, they were basically for the certain kind of benefits, certain kind of advantages, which was related there, which was associated with the tribal society. The rich natural resources attracted. And that way, the certain problematic dimensions in the development emerged out. So, at another area that we will be talking about the tribal systems of the issues of displacement and rehabilitation. But let me say that when I talk about the displaced or displacement. Now, if I say you that the people displaced due to natural calamity or people displaced due to ethnic conflicts, and the people displaced due to developmental activities. Are you able to find out the difference? The people who have been displaced either due to the natural calamity or due to the ethnic kind of rift, they could be brought back to their original habitat. But the people who have been displaced through development, that cannot be brought back. So in this very perspective, the tribal displacement has to be talked about. Earlier, the national developmental projects precisely after the second 5-year plan, from where the industrialization was highlighted. It was considered that industries are the modern temples. And people will have to make minor sacrifices for the major developmental strategy of the country. So in economy, when you started talking about the 5-year plans, where you might have come across that how the 12th 5-year plan was the last one, and from there the Niti Aayog, another perspective comes up. Then you might have gone through that how from the second 5-year plan, emphasis was more on industrialization. And when the focus shifted toward the industrialization, so in terms of establishment of industries or the developmental goals, national developmental projects, or in terms of the construction of dams, hydel projects, and even today when we're talking about the globalization, where the emphasis is on the pursuance of economic development, precisely in a tribal and also in the agrarian areas, people are being displaced. The tribals and the agrarian areas having the rich resources have suffered the most. However, it's ironical that till February 2004, there was no national policy on displacement and rehabilitation. Mind it, buddy. Second 5-year plan we're talking about. From 56 onwards. And now we're saying that there was no national policy on displacement and rehabilitation. So the picture is clear to you that what the tentative approach might have been taken. But a fact remains that since independence, lands are being acquired, ecological crisis is emerging in the name of national developmental projects, the mining, hydel projects, the tribals are being displaced, which now need to be assessed. That every national developmental project necessary, national developmental project and journey is required. Dam are to be constructed. But we basically need to weigh the benefits with the losses. And that way the debate goes that can we endanger the human and ecological lives in the name of these national developmental projects? Can we afford to lose large tracts of natural resources, green vegetation, which is not only habitat of different life forms, but also home for the millions of the people? And this concern of displacement and others, that has gone beyond the national boundary. And more precisely, when you're looking at the example of Narmada Bachao Andolan, it is no more a mere national issue. It has gone beyond the national boundary. It has now attracted the international concerns and human rights activists. It is true that there have been supporters of dam as well, though we insist that it is the best among all existing options to deal with the crisis in irrigation, drinking water, hydel energy. Such debates goes by. And that way, the displacement takes place. But sociologically speaking, you take one stand that displacement should not be taken as a one-time affair. Rather, displacement rehabilitation should be taken as a processual in nature. The day we have envisioned a certain kind of projects and we find that certain territory, tribal tracts or the certain people would be displaced, since then, to the beginning of the projects, displacing and rehabilitating, we need to have an eye on these displaced people. And in this context, if I quote Walter Fernandez says that at least 10 years should be taken, should be kept in the rehabilitation policy. However, irony that in most of the programs of rehabilitation, the focus seems to be more on compensatory measures. But here I want to quote Smriti Kothari. She argues that commitment should not be in terms of rehabilitation only, rather it should be taken as a right, not as a generosity. When you are displacing the people, then you are not generously benefiting them, you are compensating them. You are not doing showing any gesture of generosity. It is basically a right to live. And if it should not be taken as a generosity, rather it should be taken as a right to live. So the proper rehabilitation should be there. Some suggested that one person per family job, such kind of perspective should come out. So in terms of the Gadgil committee, Fernandez committee, they basically came out through which suggesting certain kind of approaches to the rehabilitation perspective. You need also to understand that you are not only displacing the people, you are also displacing the nature-man complex, that interaction with the tribals have developed or the peoples living in certain areas develop. From the Simla advanced studies kind of thing, Bhupinder Singh, he writes that due to some major plans, the ecological conditions, economic concerns, particularly tribals, have been destroyed and their values have been sacrificed. Thukral, Sanintri, we have talked about that one. They reveal that the issues of environmental problems emerging around dams, human displacement, resettlement effectively articulate the economic agenda, along with the human consequences of tempering the course of river. How the fruits of development be distributed? Should the people who have been displaced should be made part of the profit? how this equitable fruits of development of any national developmental project, either in terms of dams or in terms of Hydel 1 or in terms of industrialization or in terms of economic development, should the fruits of development be reaching to the people who have been displaced? And in this very perspective, H. A. Mathur argues that resettlement as a word is not found in most of the tribal dialect. And thus Kumar Suresh Singh suggests that apart from economic compensation, people should also be made beneficiary in the profit. T.P. Singh formula recommends one person job per family. But it was also found that due to the rampant illiteracy, this suggestion became an obstacle. Gadgil report observed that compensation is not reaching the actual displaced. And more precisely today, when we are talking about SEZ, especially economic zone, EEZ, horticulture, infrastructural development, we are finding about that how in the wake of globalization, the newer perspective and threat of displacement or rehabilitation is coming out. So you just pick up certain areas in terms of displacement and talk about the transformation challenges, part C, unit 7. That's why I said that these are the topics which are to be interrelated with one another. You should not wait for the another class, another session to talk about. They are so interrelated that you cannot separate one from another. So you talk about the definition of problems, the geographical spread, you talk about the tribe caste interaction, you talk about the tribal development, and I given it right from the very Elvin's committee lamps, tribal development blocks, all right, tribal development, TSP, tribal sub-plan, you might have gone through. Just look at this perspective. So from very Elvin to Renuka Ray committee, to the UN Endeavor, to Siliao committee, to Vidyarthi, you just talk about this very perspective. And look at the new kind of policies which have emerged, new kind of programs which have started emerging. BBTG is one which is one question that is coming out. And when you talk about the tribal administration policy, colonial and post-colonial in terms of autonomy, integration, do not approach in this manner. Approach in terms of policy of isolation, segregation, policy of assimilation, and policy of integration with a critical kind of perspective. And that way, the tribals, these are the areas which you basically need to focus. And keep an eye, only one reading in terms of the economic problems of the tribals. And most of the problems you are knowing about. Land alienation. It reminds me one of the statement of the tribal leader from South Africa. The two statements which comes out. That when the outsiders came, they had the Bible in their hand, land in our hand. They asked us to close our eyes. And when we open our eyes, Bible was in our hand, a land in their hand. One of the tribal leaders, South African leader, basically says that outside world has promised so many things to us. They also promised to take our land away. They never fulfilled their promises except one, that they had said that they will take our land, and they took it. So land alienation, indebtedness, poverty, illiteracy, right? Till date we do not have the academic courses in a tribal dialect. So you just talk on that very perspective. That would be another challenge in terms of the new education policy. You try to link on that very perspective. All right. So talk about the problems, and that way the tribals perspective that has to be talked. You know, in today's session, apart from the tribals, it another area that was there, that was taken from the second paper, part B, unit 4, social classes in India. In industrialization and urbanization in India, which we started talking about, we not only talked about the trade unions, but we also talked about the industrial class perspective. And I quoted some of the works, which to some of you, since you have not been approaching that one, so I said that empirical works are to be important. I am quoting so many, so the dimensions, the different dimensions could be talked about. And this is the way I have been teaching second paper, because second paper is not a GS. And I said that when we are approaching the certain kind of units in a second paper, the theoretical dimension that has to be talked about. So when you started talking about the stratification, we find about that how class emerged as one of the important criterion in the analysis of social stratification. Though earlier in a classical writing, the way the class was only attributed to be the feature of the Western society. But particularly when you're looking at either from the structural Marxist perspective or we are looking at it from the modernistic perspective, the class perspective has also started emerging in the Indian society. So somewhere the caste and class relationship that become the more important. So in terms of the transformation that has started taking place, the different kind of national developmental strategies, the rural reconstruction, you basically need to talk about the emergence of class kind of elements in the Indian society as well. So that way the caste and class, that interaction, that caste and class analysis has to be done. In a broader sociological perspective, we talked about the Marx, we talked about Weber. You can also be talking about them in terms of industrial class. Eric Olin Wright, Frank Parkin, in whose works we find about the sudden amalgamation of Marx and Weber. So that way, the class analysis that was in a stratification you might have gone through. Wieners. He talked about the different. Quote one or two so that the questions on a class that we have talked about. However, in the studies of social stratification, either the Indian sociologists or non-Indian sociologists, when they turn their attention to Indian society, the kind of type they confronted was a caste. Completely different from that of the class dynamics, what they had basically understood it. And more precisely, when you're looking at the advent of the Britishers, colonial period, the way the industrialization, urbanization that started, modern India started displaying the feature of the class, within which the certain theoretical perspectives also emerged out. And if I give you the one reference, the structuralist in which the Louis Dumas, I had quoted that one, while making the distinction between the stratification and a hierarchy, he considered a stratification to be open, and that way he considered that how it is the feature of a class. But a caste is hierarchical, which is closed. It means from the structuralist perspective, when looking at a caste and class, it was considered, the caste and class were considered to be the two different entities. When you look at it from the perspective of structural functions, either in terms of M.S. Srinivas, Andre Bethe and others, they said that caste and class are the distinct category, two distinct categories. But on many occasions, we find about the interaction taking place between them. In M.S. Srinivas, you might have gone through the example of the Banya. So that way, though caste and class are different, but we sometimes find about the overlapping between them. That way, the structural functions perspective came out to analyze the relations between caste and class. When the structural Marxist comes out, they say that how class is becoming more important than caste. And from the modernistic perspective, we find about that how the transformation which is taking place, the modernization that has taken place, the tradition which is either at the collapse or which is at the verge of collapse, the class perspective is emerging out. And in this very perspective, we basically started looking at it. However, it is also true that when you're talking about the class and caste kind of perspective, then there is a very close overlapping between these two. If the economic dimension is found in a caste, then there is certainly the culture dynamics is also there in a class perspective. So that way, caste in class and class in caste, casteization of class, classization of caste, such kind of perspective that needs to be focused when you are approaching the social classes in India. And once you have done this one, I said that major categories would be there in terms of Marx and Weber. And then when we started talking about the formal and informal one, we talked about this how the capitalists, the proletariats, the skilled, semi-skilled, unskilled kind of classification that has started emerging out. The shadow economy in terms of informal, we started talked about the industrial kind of perspective. So that way the diversified class perspective that I started looking at in the industrial perspective. Yet another dimension that we will have to talk about there basically, you take it from the industrialization and urbanization. When we are talking about the rural agrarian society in Indian society, either in terms of a structure or transformation, then yet another unit in part B, unit 4, social classes in India is a agrarian class structure. And in this very perspective, you basically just give the certain passing reference that how anyone who is started analyzing the Indian society, how the caste perspective became the major subject theme. However, when the sociologists turned their attention to the rural agrarian society, particularly in the Indian context, it had traditionally reflected the model of caste. But the politico-economic steps during colonial period, different measures post-independently in terms of the rural reconstruction of the rural agrarian society, the different kind of developmental strategy adopted toward this, we find that how it all gave way to the emergence of class, and thus the normative social pattern of caste considerably changed, which makes D.N. Dhanagre to comment that a new plans and policies led to the emergence of diversity in the agrarian social structure, which consequently brought the dynamics of class. I quoted D.N. Dhanagre. Social composition of groups occupying a specific class position in relation to the control of land, ownership, and the use of land are so diverse in India that it becomes difficult to incorporate all of them in a one uniform or single category. Though in some of the Indian sociological works, attempts have been initiated to focus on class category in Indian agrarian structure. For example, Daniel Thorner, we know about in terms of use the category of proprietor, farmers and laborers, which in vernacular language could be translated as Malik, Kisan and Mazdoor. And you also need to, you might have come to the Andre Bete's concept that we are talking about the Indian agrarian structure. The control, the ownership, control and use of land. It reflects the diversity, it reflects the different kind of categories. And hence it would be becoming too difficult to provide any single kind of uniformal dimensions. And with this we also talked about the Daniel Thorner, Malik, Kisan and Mazdoor. So you just give the brief that the first category has a source of income in a rent. The income is primarily derived from property rights, rent from the tenants, and this category can broadly be divided into big landlords and the rich landowners. Whereas Kisans are the working peasants owning substantial piece of land in which they indulge in cultivation with their family members. This category can also be divided into landowners and tenants. And the Mazdoors do not own land and primarily work either as a sharecropper or wage laborers. This is the Daniel Thorner's classification. However, D.N. Dhanagre considered that Thorner's classification is very close to the Indian agrarian structure. But he basically proposes a broader comprehensive model which is being influenced by Marx and Lenin's categories, such as landlords, rich peasants, middle peasants, poor peasants, and landless. TK Women has also supported this category, that is the same I am talking about, landlords, rich peasants, middle peasants, poor peasants, and landless. So you pick up this one and describe that one. So that way, the agrarian class structure could be talked about. But one of the most important from where the maximum questions have come out is basically the middle class. And they're also asking you in terms of the new emerging middle class. It means the further diversification is taking place in the middle class. When we're broadly looking at the sociological discourse, the sociological literature, the two works in terms of the class seems to be the magnum opus, locus classicus, that is all Karl Marx and a Marx paper. However, when you're looking at the Karl Marx, let me say in one line so that you can recall back. That in a Marxian analysis, there is no scope for the middle class. The way he starts talking of the polarization of society, pauperization and others, he does not leave any scope for the emergence of the middle class. However, when we are looking at the class analysis of Weber, and when he starts talking about the class position as a market position, and when he talks about the white collar, propertyless, from there we find about a certain emergence of middle class in the writings of Weber. Similar perspective could be found in Eric Olin Wright and Frank Parkin's perspective. So that way broadly in the sociological literature, that the emergence of middle class could be looked. And when we talked about modernity in Europe, consequent changes and emergence of sociology, and you also come across that how the middle class played an important role, which has contributed in the movements of Europe and made Europe to move from darker to the modern stage. The role of the middle class in terms of the bourgeois you find about in Industrial Revolution. The role of the middle class in terms of the French Revolution and its constructive role that has been talked about. And thus, certain examples of middle class has been found in a sociological literature. But I will not hesitate making a sentence that though the middle class has been there right from the Western to the Indian context, but this very analysis of middle class lacks a systematic analysis. And why this lack of systematic analysis? So it is basically opined that the middle class hold for sociologists, they consider that they are typically metropolitan in character. And it is also somewhere, this idea is somewhere also persisting in the Indian sociologists and their psyche. Though the presence of middle class was there in agrarian structure as well. I'll just be talking about that. But it did not crystallize as we are talking about the class dynamics. Popularly, in a broader perspective, the middle class emerged in India in 19th century during the British rule. However, we need to remember that there was a presence of middle class even before the advent of Britishers. But the rigid caste structure, mind the line beta, but the rigid caste structure could not produce it categorically, which became possible after the advent of Britishers. B.B. Misra, on the basis of the origin, distinguishes the Indian middle class from the Western counterpart, as he argues that in West, middle class emerged as a byproduct of economic and technological changes. However, in India, B.B. Misra says that middle class emerged by the changes brought in law and administration. And this class was produced through the administrative patronage of the British administrators. The class first engaged itself in the social reform movements, then associated itself with the national freedom movement, raised the question of the political legitimacy or political legitimate presence of the Britishers on the Indian soil. And after independence, it was the same class which became active in a nation building process. In this entire journey, long journey we are talking about, the middle class, this class imbibed new norms, values, and also provided an active participation in gender equality. But it is also true that it could not prevent itself from the conservatism. Now look at progressivism and conservatism that is going side by side. Though Ahmad argued that aim of Britishers was to create a class of imitators, I repeat the line. Ahmad is of the view that the aim of the Britishers was basically to create a class of imitators and not the originators who would be originating new values and the new methods. So the class which emerged due to the Britishers, they were basically the imitators, not the originators. Yet another work in the middle class in India has been by the Sanjay Joshi. In his study of the making of the middle class in colonial India, he attempts to explain that why the traditional sociological indicators of income and occupation would not take us very far in the understanding of this category in India. Though economic background is important, but the power and constitution of this class in India was not on economic yardstick, rather on the ability of its member to the cultural entrepreneurs, in the sense that being middle class is primarily a project of self-fastening. This is the Sanjay Joshi's work. Then if you look at the nature of question, Andre Bete attributes the rise of middle class in India to the British rule first in the province of Bengal, Bombay, Madras. Now you can change the names on the basis of occupation administrative. But later on this very class changed the occupational structure, initiating a new kind of inequality. It is the class which brought modernization, gender equality. Its size is very large, highly differentiated to the extent that, mind the line, highly differentiated to the extent that it would be appropriate to speak middle classes rather than a class to compete or who competes within itself. This is Andre Bete's perspective. So you look at middle classes, new emerging middle classes, new technological kind of perspective, the new changes, the globalization. All right. The old birth objective criteria is not the class determination. Now how the professionalism, the professional degrees, the academic or the educational degrees, they are now producing it. But here we are saying about that when Andre Bete is talking about, he says that the size of this class is so large that it will be very appropriate to talk about middle classes, not of one uniform middle class. And in India, the middle class is competing with itself. However, Yogendra Singh relates emergence of middle class with the trade and industrial development. He provides a comprehensive analysis between rural and urban middle class, who on the basis of ideological affinity, conservatism and narrow utilitarianism could be differentiated. Let me repeat the line. Ideological affinity, conservatism and narrow utilitarianism, the differentiation between the rural and urban middle class could be done. The rural middle class also harbors an intense antagonism and conflict with the urban middle classes. Even due to the sluggish and stagnant agricultural production, they are having certain kind of animosity toward the urban middle class. And look at sentence of Yogendra Singh. It seems that this middle class is trapped between tradition and modernity. I don't know whether you are aware of the name Noam Chomsky or Noam Chomsky. At least one word, one line which I find very good, and it somewhere gives a very good feeling to me that we are in Indians. That he commented that the kind of a style of middle class in India is so specific that it is not even seen in America. When you're talking about the modernism and other kind of perspective, however, you also need to talk about that Dipankar Gupta argues that dimension of consumption has been more prominent in the determination of middle class in India. Who will talk of the middle class? He says the consumption, the level of consumption or the determinant of consumption seems to be the more important one. But should we be talking about only the consumption perspective? One who dines out? One who speaks a good language? Is this the only criterion through which we will be talking about the middle class? Thus, Dipankar Gupta, Mistaken Modernity, is the book in which he talks about the concept that is called Westoxication, intoxication of the West. Alright. When you are talking about the middle class, when you are talking about this, then there in Dipankar Gupta's perspective, Westoxication comes out. And there is one work, Ghanshyam Sai, who basically tries to locate the position of middle class in between labor and capital. And when you say in between the labor and capital in such a way that this class does not control means of production to provide labor or employment, and neither this is the class which survives merely on the basis of labor. And then from there you find about the new range of questions in terms of the growing urbanization, intensification of industrialization, the occupational diversification, technological advancement, diffusion taking place due to the globalization, increased geographical mobility. We are finding about that how this very expansion of middle class has been accelerated. It is the same class which is playing an important role in some of the states in terms of the nativistic or son of the soil movement, which we talked about in terms of ethnic identity movements. We also talked about that one in terms of the regionalism. So just look at the nature of questions and you talk about, so you pick and Sanjay Joshi talk about, this is the one important one. Andre Bete you can talk about. Yogendra Singh in terms of rural and urban one, this is the important one. But do talk about the Bibi Misra so that you can basically be talking about. So remember one or two names so that the middle class and the certain questions could be done on that perspective. All right.